The Zorthax Collective's fleet loomed in space like an inevitable storm. Massive warships, adorned in cold, gleaming metal, began to circle Earth, their weapons primed and their intentions clear. They didn't just want to defeat humanity. They wanted to erase Earth from the annals of galactic history. In the heart of this looming catastrophe stood Max Riker, an unassuming systems engineer aboard the Kinetic Star, Earth's pride. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a diplomat. He was just a man who knew how to make machines work. Max sat hunched over a control panel deep in the belly of the ship, sweat beading on his brow as he monitored the ship's energy levels. His fingers flew across the buttons with practiced ease. Around him, engineers scrambled to stabilize failing systems, but Max had always been the one who understood the heart of the Kinetic Star. It was an immense, powerful ship, a testament to humanity's ingenuity, yet it wasn't invincible. Not today. The Zorthax weren't just attacking, they were studying. They weren't here to destroy Earth outright, not yet. No, they were here to test human resolve. When the first volley of fire hit, the Kinetic Star shuddered violently. Lights flickered overhead, and the floor beneath Max's feet vibrated as though the ship itself was recoiling in fear. On the comms, frantic voices called out reports of system failures. Shields were offline, propulsion was unstable, and weapons were non-functional. Shit! Shields are gone, propulsion is barely responding, a voice crackled from the comms. Max stood up, his heart pounding. There was no time to panic. His mind was already working, calculating the damage. The Zorthax had launched their attack with a precision he hadn't expected. It wasn't just firepower they had intelligence. The Kinetic Star wasn't just a ship, it was humanity's answer to galactic threats, the last line of defense. But right now, it was a dying animal, crippled and vulnerable. Max! A voice called out, sharp and urgent. Captain Lydia Hayes, the commanding officer of the Kinetic Star, stormed into the room. Her face was drawn, tense with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. I need you to get those engines running. Now. We don't have much time. Max nodded quickly, his thoughts already racing through the steps he would need to take. Understood, Captain? We're not dead yet. He dashed to another console, pulling up diagnostics on the ship's power systems. But there was something wrong. The systems were failing too quickly, almost as though they'd been deliberately tampered with. A cold wave of realization washed over him. Sabotage. Get a team on the secondary reactors. Max called out to the engineers nearby. There's something more to this attack than we've seen. The room buzzed with frantic activity, but Max didn't wait for others to catch up. His mind was sharp, and he could sense the clock ticking down. With a steady hand, he began to manually reroute power from the secondary generators to bring some semblance of order back to the ship. Captain, Max said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We've got a bigger problem. This attack isn't just about overwhelming force. It's a calculated test. Someone on board is working with the Zorthax. Hayes' eyes narrowed, her face hardening. We'll deal with that later. Fix the engines, Max. We need to get moving or we're dead. Max didn't need to be told twice. He worked quickly, tapping into the ship's diagnostic system, bypassing damaged circuits, and rerouting energy as the Kinetic Star continued to shake with each incoming blast. Every moment was a struggle, each second of delay potentially catastrophic. He had no illusions. The Zorthax didn't just want Earth's destruction, they wanted humanity's ingenuity wiped from the galactic stage. They feared humanity's potential more than anything. Max's hands flew across the panel as he focused on the engine repairs. Come on, he muttered under his breath, frustration building as the power grid flickered and died before his eyes. He could feel the weight of the situation, the hundreds of lives depending on him, but there was no time for doubt. The Zorthax had more advanced technology than they'd ever encountered, but they didn't understand humanity's most vital resource, its ability to adapt. Max didn't just fix things, he innovated. Max, talk to me, Hayes demanded, her voice rising above the din. How long until we can jump? He didn't answer immediately. He was too busy. His mind was racing through a dozen possible solutions at once. But then it hit him. He glanced at the data stream from the auxiliary systems. Something clicked. "I've got an idea," Max muttered, his heart leaping as the thought formed. He rushed over to another console, pulling up a series of complex schematics for the Kinetic Star-S propulsion system. "I can route power through the auxiliary thrusters," he explained to the captain. "It'll give us enough boost to break orbit and get us clear of the immediate blast radius. It's not ideal, but it'll buy us time to fix the primary engines." Hayes gave him a hard look, as though weighing the risks. But she didn't hesitate. "Do it." Max's fingers danced over the console. His heart hammered in his chest, each passing moment feeling like an eternity. With a deep breath, he initiated the sequence, rerouting power and initiating the auxiliary thrusters. The ship groaned as the new power flow surged through it. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, a sudden lurch threw Max against the side of the console as the Kinetic Star-S thrusters roared to life. The ship's engines hummed, then powered up, the auxiliary systems burning brightly. The ship slowly moved, surging toward a temporary escape route, away from the core of the Zorthax fleet. "We're moving," Max said, a breath of relief escaping his lips. But he knew this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. "Not good enough," Hayes replied coldly, still scanning the data. "The Zorthax have already launched a second wave." Max's pulse quickened. "We can't outrun them forever. We need a way to fight back." The answer came to him, though it was far from easy. The Zorthax had studied humanity for years, finding out how humans reacted under pressure. What they didn't understand was that when pushed to the brink, humanity didn't fold. They innovated. They adapted. Max wasn't a soldier, but he knew exactly how to turn this around. "We're going to turn their own tech against them," he said, his voice steady. "I'll need access to the Zorthax communications array. We've got to plant a virus in their systems." "What kind of virus?" Hayes asked, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. "A virus that'll make their ships turn on each other," Max said, his confidence growing. "We'll use their own weapons against them. I'll need a team." Hayes hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "You've got it." Max wasn't sure how long they had, but he knew that every second counted. The Zorthax thought they understood humanity, but Max was about to show them how wrong they were. And in doing so, he would prove that humans, even when faced with annihilation, would always find a way to survive. Max Riker stared at the glowing screen before him, his fingers moving rapidly across the console. The kinetic stars shook violently again as another wave of enemy fire struck. The ship's systems were failing faster than he could fix them, and the Zorthax fleet wasn't giving them any breathing room. Max didn't need to be told twice. The mission was simple: fix the ship. But it wasn't that easy. "Max, we need those engines back online, now!" Captain Hayes' voice echoed over the comms, cutting through the chaos. Max could hear the strain in her voice, the tension rising with every passing second. "I'm working on it," Max snapped back, his eyes darting over diagnostics and rerouting power through damaged systems. But something wasn't right. The power levels fluctuated unpredictably, and the auxiliary thrusters, while keeping them mobile, weren't enough to outrun the enemy. Then it hit him. This wasn't just a straightforward attack. He felt the cold creep of realization seep into his bones. The Zorthax weren't just blowing up ships, they were playing with them. "This is sabotage," he muttered, his voice grim. "What?" Hayes asked. "Explain yourself." Max's mind raced, analyzing the pattern of failures. They weren't just damaging the ship. The systems were designed to fail in sequence, to cripple them at their most vulnerable points. He punched in a few commands, accessing deeper levels of the ship's data feeds. "They're not just attacking. Someone on board is making sure we can't fight back." Hayes didn't hesitate. "Find the traitor, Max. If we're going down fighting, but not without every advantage we can get." "I'll find them, Captain," Max said, his voice tight with determination. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a problem solver, and right now, this problem was life or death. He scanned the ship's systems once more. The sabotage wasn't subtle. It was meticulously executed, like a calculated game of chess. Power was being drained from the auxiliary systems, the backup generators stalling just when they were needed most. It was deliberate, a message. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to disable the kinetic star. Max's hands flew across the controls as he bypassed damaged systems and worked to restore power to the most critical components. As he did, his mind kept drifting back to the sabotage. How long had the traitor been here? Who could it be? The ship's crew had always seemed loyal, but in times of war, loyalty was never guaranteed. Max, talk to me. Hayes's voice crackled through the comms again. We need those engines up. The Zorthaks aren't waiting. I know, Captain, Max said, his voice tight. He wasn't going to stop until he found a solution. The engine diagnostics flashed before his eyes, but it wasn't just the engines that were the problem, it was everything. The systems were being overridden, and he knew that unless he found the traitor quickly, the ship would be a sitting target. Max tapped into the main security feeds, searching for anything unusual. There, just a flicker. Someone was accessing systems they shouldn't. His heart pounded as he locked onto the signal. A pattern emerged. A specific crew member's credentials had been used to manipulate the power grid. Max's fingers stilled over the console as the name flashed across the screen. Lieutenant Xander. I've got a lead, Max said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. Xander. He's the one accessing systems. He's been tampering with the ship. Xander? Hayes's voice was sharp with disbelief. He's one of my top officers. Are you sure? There's no mistake, Max said, his mind already formulating a plan. But it's not enough to just confront him. He's probably set up more failsafes to prevent anyone from stopping him. Hayes's voice softened, almost reluctant. You're sure about this, Max? I'm sure, Max replied, the weight of the situation settling in. He's working with the Zorthaks, Captain. He's been playing both sides. Then we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with it. Hayes's tone was resolute. Max's fingers moved quickly as he patched into the ship's security system. Xander had access to critical areas, but he also had a trail. Max wasn't just going to shut down the sabotage, he was going to turn it around. He tapped in a sequence of commands, installing a backdoor into the ship's system that would allow him to track Xander's movements. It was risky. If Xander noticed, the traitor would erase his tracks in seconds. But Max didn't have time to second-guess himself. Within moments, Max's screen flickered again, showing Xander's location, Deck 11. Max grabbed a tool kit and headed for the nearest maintenance lift. He didn't have backup. He couldn't afford to alert Xander. If the lieutenant realized his cover was blown, Max wouldn't just be fighting sabotage. He'd be fighting for his life. The lift hummed as it descended, and Max tried to steady his breathing. This was it. If he was wrong about Xander, it wouldn't just be the ship that was doomed. Earth would be next. When the lift doors opened, Max moved quickly, slipping into the corridor. The ship's lights flickered ominously overhead as he made his way toward the security checkpoint. Xander's presence on the systems was unmistakable now, and Max followed the trail with careful precision. He rounded a corner and froze. There was Xander, standing by a console, his back turned to Max. He was too focused on the screen in front of him to notice Max's approach. Max moved silently, every muscle in his body taut. He had one shot at this. The last few feet seemed to stretch into eternity as he crept closer. His hand brushed the edge of a tool hanging at his belt, a small but powerful device. With one quick motion, Max swung it, hitting Xander's shoulder hard enough to knock him off balance. The lieutenant spun around in surprise, his hand already reaching for the sidearm at his hip. Max acted fast, grabbing Xander's wrist and twisting it, disarming him in a single fluid motion. Xander's eyes widened in shock, but Max didn't give him a chance to recover. "You're going to stop what you're doing," Max said, his voice low and threatening. "Now." Xander grimaced, struggling against Max's grip. You think you can stop this? The Zorthax will. Max cut him off. You've underestimated us. You've underestimated Earth. He twisted Xander's arm a little more, the pain making the lieutenant wince. Now you'll tell me everything. Xander's face hardened, but he knew the battle was lost. You'll never defeat them. The Zorthax will destroy your world, just like they planned to destroy you. Max's grip tightened. Not if I stop you first. With one final, decisive motion, Max slammed Xander's hand down on the console, overriding the sabotage codes. The systems flickered back to life. Power began to surge back into the engines, and the emergency lights went from red to green. The kinetic star was alive again. Xander slumped, defeated, as Max stepped away, watching as the traitor was escorted by security to a holding cell. The ship was back on track, but the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Max turned toward the nearest control panel, his fingers already moving to restore the last of the systems. He wasn't just fixing machines anymore. He was fixing humanity's future. And he wasn't about to let the Zorthax, or anyone else, erase that. Max's hands flew over the console, his mind operating faster than his fingers could keep up. The kinetic star shuddered again as another wave of enemy fire hit, but Max couldn't afford to think about that. Not right now. The ship was still alive, still moving, but barely. The Zorthax fleet, now fully aware of the sabotage, was tightening their grip. They were already adapting. They weren't just powerful, they were calculating. And right now, Max was the only thing standing between the Zorthax and humanity's survival. The sabotage had only been the beginning. The traitor, Lieutenant Xander, had made sure of that. Now Max had to finish what he started. His fingers tapped rapidly, rerouting power to different sections of the ship, trying to compensate for the systems that kept failing. His mind worked 100 steps ahead, visualizing every circuit, every piece of machinery, even the ship's delicate power grid. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was humanity's last hope. Max, I need you to talk to me. Captain Hayes's voice crackled over the comms, sharp and clear despite the chaos. What's the situation? Max's response was automatic, but the tension in his voice was undeniable. I'm getting power back, Captain. But it's not enough. We need to turn the tables. We need to do more than survive. And what do you have in mind? Hayes's voice was tight, but she trusted Max. He had already shown that his skill with machines was the only reason the ship was still moving. Max hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I'm going to reverse their advantage, he said, his voice low, determined. I'm going to use their own tech against them. Hayes's voice came through again, barely more than a whisper. You're talking about hacking their systems. How? I don't have all the answers yet, Max said, his voice steady. But I can access their communication lines. If I can plant a virus in their fleet's systems, it'll disrupt their coordination. The Zorthax rely on their flawless system network to stay one step ahead. If I can break that, if I can make them turn on each other, you'll force them to fight amongst themselves. Hayes finished for him. I like it. Max didn't reply, not wanting to jinx it. He had no idea if it would even work, but it was all they had. If he could break the Zorthax's perfect system, even just for a few minutes, humanity might have a chance. He stood up abruptly, his gaze flickering across the room. I'm going to need access to their communications array. I can't do this from here. The bridge was silent for a moment. Hayes's voice came back, softer now but resolute. We're making our way to the command deck. Get there, Max. You've got 5 minutes. 5 minutes. It was barely enough time, but it was all they had. Max's mind was already calculating. The kinetic star wasn't just a ship, it was a fortress, a weapon, and right now, he was the only one who could make it work. He bolted from the engineering bay, his footsteps quick and heavy as he made his way to the lift. The ship rumbled beneath him, every movement feeling like a countdown. His pulse quickened. He couldn't afford to fail. The lift doors slid open, and Max moved down the corridor, past the shattered remains of the crew's quarters and the dimly flickering emergency lights. The closer he got to the command deck, the more the ship seemed to shake. He wasn't sure if it was from the Zorthax's fire or the weight of the task before him, but it didn't matter. He had no choice but to keep going. When he reached the command deck, he found the crew already working, their hands moving as fast as his had earlier. Hayes was at the helm, her eyes hard with focus. She looked up when he arrived, her brow furrowed in concern. 5 minutes, she said sharply. Max, what do you need? Max didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, tapping a few keys on the nearest console, bypassing security systems as he accessed the Zorthax fleet's communication lines. His fingers flew over the controls as he connected to their network, the screens in front of him displaying the dark, alien symbols of their technology. I'm in, Max muttered, mostly to himself. Now for the hard part. He started working quickly, writing the virus code as fast as he could. His mind was still racing, trying to stay one step ahead of the Zorthax. They were advanced, yes, but they weren't perfect. Their reliance on their tech was both a strength and a weakness, and Max was betting that he could exploit it. Max, Hayes's voice broke through his concentration. The Zorthax are targeting the ship's engines. They're trying to shut us down completely. Max glanced up, seeing the growing red icons on the screen. His heart pounded. There was no time. He slammed his fingers onto the keyboard, completing the code. With a final press of a key, he sent the virus through their systems. For a long moment, nothing happened. Max held his breath, his eyes fixed on the screen. The Zorthax's systems seemed to hum, but nothing changed. Then, with a sudden, gut-wrenching jolt, the entire ship shook. The screens in front of him flickered and then turned black. Max cursed under his breath, thinking for a moment that he had failed. But then, a new set of messages began to appear on the console. The Zorthax's communications network was collapsing, the virus working its way through their systems. What had been a finely tuned machine was now a broken mess. The Zorthax fleet began to lose cohesion. Ships that had once been perfectly synchronized now veered off course. Some fired at their own allies. Others scrambled to realign, but the damage was done. We've got it, Max said, his voice shaking with relief. They're turning on each other. Hayes stood up from the helm, her eyes gleaming with a mix of disbelief and triumph. You did it! We've got a shot. Max's hands were still shaking, but he forced himself to stay focused. It won't last long. We need to take advantage of this now. Hayes nodded. All hands, prepare for a counteroffensive. Launch everything we've got. The ship shuddered again as the crews sprang into action. Max watched as the systems came back online, the kinetic Star-S weapons coming to life. They were still outgunned, still facing the overwhelming force of the Zorthax fleet, but now they had an edge. For the first time in hours, Max felt something like hope. The ship's cannons fired, taking advantage of the chaos the virus had caused. Zorthax ships spun out of formation, their weapons firing wildly in all directions. The humans were still outnumbered, but now they were fighting with a new kind of strategy, one they had never used before. They were fighting against a disorganized enemy, an enemy that was no longer as invincible as it had once seemed. Max stood at the control panel, his heart pounding as the battle unfolded around him. This was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a chance. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting back. We're not done yet, Max said, his voice steady. But we've got them right where we want them. Hayes gave him a sharp look, but there was a glint in her eye now. Don't stop until we've won. Max nodded, fingers already moving over the console, ready to push the kinetic star further into the fray. They were humans, after all. And no matter how much the Zorthax underestimated them, they were about to learn that humanity never gave up. Not ever. Max's fingers hovered over the console as the final seconds ticked away. The ship was alive, but barely. The Zorthax fleet, broken and disoriented by the virus he had planted in their systems, was in full retreat, yet they still outnumbered them by 100 to 1. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Max knew that the Zorthax wouldn't give up so easily. They would regroup, re-establish their systems, and come for them again. If they could. Max wasn't sure how long the virus would hold, but every second counted. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at the control panel, fingers moving methodically over the keys. Power was still coming back online, though not at the level they needed to fight at full strength. The kinetic star had its systems restored, but the damage was extensive. He had no illusions. If they didn't take the fight to the Zorthax now, they would be sitting ducks. He wasn't going to wait for that to happen. Max, Captain Hayes's voice came through the comms. We've got them off our tail for now, but how much longer can we keep this up? We're sitting on a time bomb here. Max's jaw tightened. He understood. Every moment the Zorthax were left alive meant the potential for them to recover, to rally, and come back with even more devastating force. Max tapped into the ship's weapon systems again, desperately trying to power up the cannons. He needed them fully operational, and fast. I'm working on it, he said. His voice was tight. He didn't need the pressure. The time for hesitating was long past. The virus was their only chance, but it wasn't foolproof. He needed something more, something that would allow them to take the fight back to the Zorthax, to finish what they'd started. You don't have much time, Hayes warned, her tone hard. If you've got a plan, now would be the time to use it. Max's eyes darted across the readouts in front of him. His mind was racing through every possibility, but the answer was right in front of him. The Zorthax had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to think on their feet. They thought they could destroy Earth and its people with brute force, but they'd missed the most important lesson: humans were resourceful. He quickly accessed the Kinetic Star-S auxiliary system. The secondary weapon systems were still offline, but if he could tap into them, if he could combine them with the ship's remaining power, they might just have enough to make one last, devastating push. It wasn't ideal. It was a gamble. But Max was done with waiting for a miracle. He was going to make his own. Captain, Max said, his voice focused. I need you to reroute all remaining power to the main cannon. Get ready for one last shot. Hayes didn't question him. Understood. Max felt his heart rate spike as he rerouted the power. The systems flickered again, the ship groaning beneath the strain. He wasn't sure how much the kinetic star could take, but the Zorthax were circling, licking their wounds, preparing for another assault. They needed to hit hard and fast. The final moments dragged on. Max's fingers moved in a blur as he worked to fuse the auxiliary systems with the main weapon systems. The countdown was on. He knew the Zorthax were already starting to repair their fleet, to organize another wave of firepower. But if he could hit them now, in their disarray, he could cripple them for good. Max, do you have a lock on them? Hayes's voice crackled through the comms again. I've got a lock, Max replied. His pulse raced. We'll have one shot at this. We're going to need to make it count. The console in front of him lit up, showing a green lock symbol on the Zorthax flagship. The virus had done its job, if only for a moment, but it had created the window Max needed. Their systems were still recovering, still disorganized. This was his shot. He slammed his fist down on the console, initiating the firing sequence. The ship's engines roared to life as the auxiliary power surged through the weapon systems, and the main cannon hummed with energy. Max held his breath, waiting for the confirmation. A single blinding beam of light erupted from the kinetic star, cutting through the void with precision and force. It slammed into the Zorthax flagship, the massive ship shaking under the impact, its shields flickering and collapsing under the strain. The Zorthax vessel had been vulnerable, struggling to recalibrate, and Max's shot exploited that vulnerability perfectly. The flagship groaned, its outer hull buckling and sparks flying in every direction. Direct hit! Hayes shouted, her voice full of raw triumph. You did it, Max! The flagship's shields are down! Max's heart was racing, but he didn't let himself celebrate yet. He watched the systems closely, the countdown ticking, knowing the Zorthak's fleet wouldn't stay disoriented for long. The flagship was damaged, but the battle wasn't over. The remaining ships would retaliate, and they were still a massive force. The kinetic star was outgunned, and while the hit on the flagship was a victory, it wasn't enough to win the war. "Max," Hay said, her voice tight with focus. "We've got to push. Take out their secondary fleet. If we don't hit them now, they'll recover." Max didn't hesitate. "Give me a few seconds." He began recalibrating the remaining weapons systems, adjusting their trajectory for maximum impact. The Zorthak's flagship was down, but the fleet was still circling, still a threat. Max knew that they could hit them, that they could break them once and for all, but only if they moved quickly. They had to seize the opportunity before the Zorthaks managed to recover. The next wave of fire erupted from the kinetic star, blasting through the remnants of the Zorthaks fleet, each shot targeted with deadly precision. It wasn't just raw power they were relying on, it was ingenuity. They weren't the strongest, but they were smart. They were human. Max's fingers danced across the console, his thoughts locked on the battle ahead. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but there was no time for weakness now. Every shot counted. The Zorthak's fleet had been caught off guard once, but now they were retaliating with everything they had left. Max didn't have time to second-guess himself. Every decision he made now would be the difference between survival and annihilation. The ship's systems hummed as the weapons fired again, this time taking out several smaller Zorthaks vessels in one devastating barrage. Max could feel the tension crackle through the air, every moment stretching out as if time itself was slowing. It wasn't enough. He knew that. But then, just as he thought they were about to be overwhelmed, the Zorthak's flagship's engine sputtered and died. The ship began to drift, its remaining crew scrambling to regain control. The remaining ships hesitated. It was a crack in their defenses, a fracture in their resolve. The kinetic star had done it, they had delivered a decisive blow. Max slumped into the chair, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. The battle wasn't over, but it was a turning point. The Zorthak's fleet was faltering. The tide had turned. And humanity had once again proved that they would never go down without a fight.